Hello, welcome back to another After Effects video. In this I want to look at lights in After Effects. So, just as with a camera you can press Control Shift Alt and C to get a new camera, you can do Control Shift Alt and L to get a new light. And lights have got a bunch of different settings. There's a lot of different words like how light diffuses, like the specular glint on certain sort of glossy objects maybe that you can sort of think about with lights. But in general the most important settings are these ones here: intensity, cone angle and cone feather. So we're going to leave the default and we're going to choose a spotlight. Now, another also thing to mention with lights is that typically 2D layers are not affected by light. 3D layers, they have a default ambient light. And they're the two different types of light that you've got. You basically have a source light or you have an ambient light. So spot is an example of a source light. All right, and you can see what happens. Essentially, it places, we've got the position and we've got the point of interest similar to a camera. Point of interest is there and the position is nearer the camera or whatever, nearer, in front. So what we could do is we could say we want to keep that point of interest because this is what we're looking at, and we want to move the position only. So we can find our spot where it says XZ, hold down the control key, and we're going to move that over here. So you can see all the values of position are changing, all the values of point of interest are remaining the same. So we could position it somewhere like that. Okay, so now we can take a look. If we press this and press AA, similar to a camera, we can see a bunch of stats. So again, we can see essentially the stats you saw in the menu. So if we change the intensity here of the light, you can see it's going to go below 0 as well if we wanted to darken an object. So you can do that. We'll leave that one at 100 though. Now the cone angle, we take a look, we can see the cone angle here. You can see what happens if we lower that. So that's going to go into a specific area here. So if we change it to a low cone angle, and then we lower the feather, what you're going to see here is we're going to get this sort of spotlight effect. So everywhere is dark apart from this sort of area. And this is obviously good if you're doing like a dark shot, you want to focus on a specific thing. The other alternative as well that you can do is you can do a larger cone angle and a large feather. And that kind of like lets everything sort of diffuse. Let's briefly look at how to do some animation with this. So you can see I've currently got a couple of these video clips. They're at the same position on the Z, obviously different X's, 4286 on the Z. And you can see their X's are going from -256 to 2107. All right, so let's do Control Shift Alt L light. And you can see it puts the light in the center. We're obviously going to need to change that. So if it's at -4286, so if the Z is at 4286, let's put it, say, about 3500. So that will put it in a reasonable spot there. And we also need to make sure that we have our point of interest. So our point of interest is probably going to be, we can at least take a value from this position, right, as the point of interest. So that would do the point of interest there. Let's say the way I want to do the animation is we want the light to go from left to right, and then the point of interest is going to go from right to left. Okay, so from this position, actually, we can fairly straightforward animate it. So let's start by doing the positions. Say -1000, right? And then by the end of it, we want to be all the way on the other side. So obviously, because we're quite far back, it's a lot bigger than the 1920 that we would normally need to go. So you can also press Shift as well to go quicker. So that gives you a demonstration of how you can sort of alter between the two different sources. But yeah, you can see exactly what happens here. Now we're going to look at a point light. So we'll create a new light and we're going to change this to a point light. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a very high intensity light. Let's take a look. All right, I also would like to do two views. And here you can see where the light is. So the way a point light works, you can see as I move it nearer the surface here, that's what it does. So it doesn't have a cone angle like a spotlight. So it's to do with how near the surface you're moving it, right? I wonder if we could extenuate the color here with some yellow. Yellow lights work really well with this particular clip. Let's try even increasing the intensity as much as we can. That's a pretty awesome effect, that. Certainly adds quite a lot to the clip, that. Let's lengthen the path. And what we could also try is just seeing what happens if we go a little bit closer to it. So we're currently about 100 blocks in front of it. Let's maybe go like 50 blocks in front. Let's go like much closer, maybe like 10 blocks in front. And then we'll maybe go 200 blocks in front. Maybe 300 there. You definitely get some really interesting effects by doing this. So let's focus now on a couple more types of light. Alright, so we're going to get our light, and we're going to choose this parallel light this time, intensity 100. Interesting, because it's this angle between the light and the point of interest that is actually what is going to define the brightness of the light. So for instance, you can see this angle here. So you can see there's only like a certain quadrant that we're in this line here. Let's try like here. Let's just try and get the line straight. I believe that if it's basically if this line is straight on both top and left, it's basically going to be full brightness. You can see this distance stuff isn't making much difference. You know, the distance in the Z, right? It's kind of like parallel light is kind of like an ambient light. You can imagine doing something like this, right? You could do a fade to black. That could be one application of it. Remove the feather a little bit. So when you get the actual light in the right place, this is actually kind of like an interesting effect that you can do. I would probably want to make the intensity a lot more, just to maybe like to see what will change if we change things with the ambient lighting here. So you can see as we go really high on this, you can see the actual the feather, even though the feather's really low, kind of can make it like less important. If we do the feather higher here, it means we don't need to go to the intensity here. Kind of helps like the blending of it, I guess. So yeah, so you can see essentially what we've done here. I've put the intensity higher and much higher for the spotlight. So if we have no ambient light, we're just going to get that. If we have no spotlight, so you can see like in general, like what it kind of lets us do is we have much darker here and just have like a, you know, it's sort of like how you, it's sort of almost like you need to bring the two together, like the ambient light with this particular spotlight. Obviously this wheel is much darker in the first place because it's a darker color. Like if this whole area was sort of shrouded in whatever, we could then increase the cone angle. And that would give another way to blend it together. I want to look at diffuse and specular lights. So essentially it's just some of the objects for lighting. So if we take a look, press AA on here, we can see we've got material options. So shadows is kind of like a whole another topic. But if we look at, for instance, from here, you can basically choose, first of all, you can choose whether you accept lights at all, right? So if you press off, it will just go back to the full image. Otherwise, you will accept lights. This button here, the ambient light, is how much it's going to be affected by an ambient light. So the ambient light is obviously what sort of, you know, lights evenly the layer. So if you wanted something not to be affected by it, you could put that at 0. Okay, so the next options are essentially diffuses on its own in a category, and then the specular intensity, specular shininess, and metal are all in a group together. So diffuse lights are the primary kind of light thing. So their fall off will match, the fall off the lighting is going to match whatever light you're using. So let's take a look at the difference here. So you can see that's going to sort of, you can see how that's primary, whereas the specular intensity is to do with hotspots. So if we take a look here, you can see it's creating a spot right at where the light is. And you can moderate the fall off. The metal section is going to be at 0, the color comes from the light. So you can see this is the color of the light. So shadows are off by default, so we're going to need to turn them on. So we're going to double click here and we're going to tick this box. Nothing happens, and that's because you have to turn the shadows on for each individual layer. So we'll take this layer here and we're going to press AA, and cast shadows is going to be on. And that way you can see that when we move this around, you see it's got a shadow, right? Okay, so a couple more options that we can do with shadows as well. If we go to the bottom of the list on the lights here, so if we take a look down here, you'll see we've got two options: shadow darkness and shadow diffusion. Essentially, it's kind of a bit like masks. Darkness is just going to be how much you can see the shadow, so from invisible, like the opacity, right? The shadow diffusion is kind of interesting. It's kind of like feathering. So if we look at this, you see you get a more kind of like washed out, sort of hazy effect. And that will give you a more kind of subtle approach to the shadow. So the good thing about shadows in After Effects is that they're not affected, they're rendered separately. So just to begin, we're going to look at this, what I've got here. We've got the camera, the light, a point light, the wheel, and then the background image, which is like is at 0 on the Z. So you can see from this top view where everything is at the moment. You can see the shadow at the moment is quite small, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move it beyond. So it's currently at minus 1246. We're going to move it further back, right? Only in the Z. So I'll press Control, and this is going to be the Z axis. And you see what's going to happen. As we move it closer, you can see the shadow increases in size. So this is the way you can get the increase in size, and you can see it goes all the way through, and then at this point it's just going to be. So what we'll do is we'll choose a good position for the shadow, say somewhere like this. Now, like I say, with the blending modes, it's kind of interesting because what you can do is you can select our layer here, press F4, and then you can choose a blending mode for the shadow. Let's try. I think, funnily enough, I think Divide is probably the one I like the best here. So that gives kind of a cool effect. Let's see if we increase move it a bit closer, see what that's going to look like. Different scale. So that is going to give quite an interesting effect, actually. So you'll notice that this light, which is in front here, and we've got the ship's wheel, and then we have onto the wall. If we actually go around and take a look at the back around here, it's not going through, right? And that is to do with the light transmission. So what it essentially means, right, is if we went to this layer here, there's obviously going to be a bunch of light on that layer. So if we then decided to change the light transmission value here, you can see it's currently at 0%. We're going to do that. And you'll see, and we actually stay around the back, you can see how it goes through the back. Okay, so how do we get custom shadows then? So obviously you can change things with the shadow, you can make it sort of further away. But what do we want? Just a completely like customized shadow. Well, what you want to do then in that situation is you need to copy the layer, right? So you've got two of them. So that will do that. We'll copy and paste this one. Now you need to do some specific settings for each one. So for the top layer, all we really want to see is the layer. So I'm just going to hide this bottom one here for a second. So for this one, if we take a look at the settings, we're going to do cast shadows off. Okay, so now we just have our image of the ship's wheel. Okay, let's turn the layer with just the picture of the wheel off now. And then we're going to go to layer 4. And you can see currently we have cast shadows on. If you turn it to only, you can see now we've just got the shadow. We don't have the actual picture of it. Okay, I've chosen this effect, the tritone effect. So what we're going to do is we're going to increase our light transmission to 100. And we're just going to do a few subtle changes. So I'm just going to bring this up a bit. And with the shadows, we can just do the same thing. Okay, So something like that perhaps. And then it's simply a case of turning all the layers on. Now we're going to look at something called gels, which is essentially when you place an object between the light and the background, and the qualities of that object give a sort of interesting appearance on the background. So that is what we're going to do. So we're going to place our egg in here. You can see the egg. If we take a look at the position here, we're going to make sure the egg is at 225. So you can see the egg is right in front of it there. And it's sort of like in line with all the other things that we happen to have here. So if we take a look at all the layers here, we can just take a look at the positions of things. So the question is, how do we create the gel from this? And generally what you want to have is pretty good light transmission, but you want to make sure you have cast shadows on only. And you need to do that on the movie layer. So let's do that. So currently cast shadows is off. Now if we turn it on, you can see you're going to get that border, you're going to get the big shadow behind it. If we turn it to only, we'll get rid of the egg itself. But now if we increase the light transmission to like quite a high value, it's going to really blend in like a pleasant way with the background. So you can see that effect. If we move it back, you can see it becomes almost absorbed into the point of the light there. I want to show something a little bit more with gels, which is how the shadows can affect multiple objects. So here you can see I've got a similar scene to I had previously. I've decided to put an ambient light as well on. And ambient light is kind of cool because if you just have no ambient light, you basically just have your point light, which will light up the thing. But an ambient light is obviously much more kind of general for like a multi-use purpose, right? So if you put that on, you could then, you can light up the whole scene if you want. So that is kind of like a cool thing that you can do with the ambient light. But what I specifically wanted to show was I've got the egg is currently on its materials, cast shadows only, a little bit of light transmission there, and it's got a little animation. But what I wanted to see, you can't really see like, what it's actually doing. So if you put something in, we've got another image here, and you can see I've set this to a value of 200 on the Z. And this egg, it goes between 3 and about 200 on the Z. So it's actually going to be nearer the camera, right, at all times. So that means the shadow is going to be reflecting onto it the whole time. And you can see the cool effect that you get. It's kind of like, it's saying that there's a portal to the outside. Like imagine this is like the inside of like a wooden building, and there's a garden outside. And this egg is actually creating that shadow to see outside. So that's kind of like a cool effect. You can imagine like quite a few different applications where that would be pretty useful to use that. So this is another thing I just briefly wanted to show. And that is when you can see, if you look at the positions here, it's kind of getting closer to, you can see obviously it's getting closer to it. Here's the egg at the bottom, and there's the window. But when it's projecting onto two different surfaces, you get like a multitude of different effects. One is it's sort of like, it's almost like a little Pac-Man thing eating the window. And the other one is what happens here, where the actual shadow is it becomes a larger shadow. And that's because this point, this section here where it's going like that, if that was on the back wall, it wouldn't be there, would it? It would be here. It would be like that. So that is a way to look at the distance between the objects to actually kind of extend the size of the shadow. And that looks something like something that's probably going to be pretty powerful as well. I definitely think this approach, I mean, you can imagine if it wasn't an egg, for instance, what if the shadow was one of these beams instead? That would look really cool, right? Because then you'd be, like, it could be all black and you could all like reveal something. So yeah, lots of different approaches and things that you can potentially do here. So thanks for watching.